All right, we're going to finish off social engineering today and the authentication module. So yeah, the homework for the lab number 4, that's due on Monday because we'll just be finishing the material today. And hopefully those labs aren't too time consuming. So we left off, we left off on, so we're trying to spoof legitimate users, and that's what social engineering typically does, targets the identity of a legitimate user in order to get something accomplished by the adversary. So we've been just going through our different steps. We talked about hacking individuals, which we did a whole bunch of examples of, all these different lures to get individual victims like the consumer to do something. And now we're in the middle of hacking organizations. How can we attack businesses, governments, these sorts of things? And we left off on business email compromise. So as the name suggests, we're trying to get into a business entity. And this is one of the fastest growing ways of losing money in this country. So it's a $43 billion headache. That was something over the summer that was reported by the FBI. The FBI has a task force addressing this that is just going bonkers because this activity is so prevalent. It's also known as email account compromise. And the idea is that we are using email for a whole bunch of financial transactions, like acknowledgement, instructions for financial payments, that if you can hijack that in any way, you have jackpot. And adversaries have figured this out. So what is the approach? The adversary will either compromise a legitimate account or spoof a legitimate account. So hijacking an account is fairly easy. You could either do malware, you can trick a person into installing malware, you could just phish the credentials, you could do the credential stuffing stuff that we talked about earlier to try and get access to a legitimate email account. And once you have access to this, this is where the adversary can sort of like understand what you have access to. The other option is for the adversary to create a lookalike account and then to trick people into believing it's the real account that you trust. And then you get different kinds of access that way. So for example, if you have an email address that looks like this, then maybe you can create one that's a lookalike account that's not legitimate, that you trick the adversary into, or the victim into communicating with. The next thing you would do is groom the recipient, groom the person. So you're going to use this account to target someone. And so you have to, what they call, groom that person into trusting you. And so you'll monitor the email threads. Maybe you'll just be a passive listener for a little while. You'll understand what the user typically does and what the workflow of the company is, especially the financial workflow. You might even send some emails to build trust, especially if you're doing a lookalike account. You might send some innocuous things that don't have anything really suspicious in them, just so that people are used to communicating with you. So that would be the grooming part of this. And then you attack at a very opportune moment in time. You will then try and spearfish an email message that just looks like and is timed like an authentic request. And in a way that, because you've done your grooming, the targets don't question the validity of that message that you send. And then this is the actions on objectives. So, get access to company accounts, calendars, data, or to payment information, or to sort of corrupt the payment information of that process. Yeah.
Do pixel trackers factor into the grooming phase?
Pixel trackers, in what sense?
Like just being able to tell when people open emails.
So tracking the user, so the victim would understand. Oh, you mean for an organization to try and thwart this?
So a pixel tracker being like, you send an image and then.
Is this at the adversary or as the? Okay, so the adversary is sending some pixels in the email to try and figure out when it's going to be read. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know of any active. So that could be a method. I don't know of it being actively used. But yeah, that would be the idea, is to collect as much behavioral information as you can, so that when you actually do the attack, it's like, oh, I believe that. I get 95% success rate. That's what you're doing. And you have time. You can bide time as long as you're not like exposing yourself as having that access. And we'll talk about this, like how can we detect if someone has access like this? You can get this to work. So here are some example scenarios, and some of these have happened very recently. In fact, in this case, it wasn't a CEO, it was the dean of our college asking someone to purchase dozens of gift cards and then to send the serial numbers back because he wants to send them out as sort of like prizes or awards or these sorts of things. Hey, this person won Professor of the Month. I want to send him a gift card, to just show I've never won Professor of the Month, but just a scenario. I want to send him a gift card. Here, buy a whole bunch. Give me the codes. I'm going to email it to this person. And again, use the power differential to get that to work. But you have to ask in a way that makes it look like a legitimate message. A company CFO instructing the accounts payable department to wire money to a vendor account to pay an invoice, right? That's typical business behavior on the back end. And if it's done via email, you'd be like, oh, that's a message that gets sent all the time. So I'm just going to do it because it's the CFO. Of course, I would do that. Or here's one, a title company instructing a home buyer on how to wire payment to complete a real estate transaction, or even a seller, right? Where to deposit the money. So these are email messages that are juicy because they are high value. And this can lead to hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses, and it's instantaneous. This is why adversaries are much more focused on this than things like ransomware. Although ransomware does work because it's so easy to get people to fall for ransomware, it takes a long time to monetize ransomware, right? You have to actually do customer service on the victim so that you can get the payment and negotiate payment and get that whole thing to work. Here, you steal the money and you're done. Like, it's a one-shot thing if you can get this to work as an adversary. So here are some famous examples, and I'm not going to go through these things, but you can click on these things. I mean, the all-time largest one is 121 million, and this was Facebook and Google. So so they caught him, guy from Lithuania, but that's the biggest one that I know of. Ubiquity. So we talked about this one earlier. That was the 46 million one. Toyota and Schooler are some of the other big ones. Over the summer, there was this one. I don't know if you saw this one. This was 1.4 million from the city of Portland. And then I was part of this article because I guessed it was BEC, but I actually don't know. This has never been verified, but I think that this is probably BEC. So this is the FBI's marketing material. So the FBI is trying to train all the enterprises, all the businesses out there about this kind of activity. It's really hard to prevent. There is no silver bullet except for things like this. So this is one of the roles that the FBI plays in trying to prevent this kind of activity. And so they go through the entire process that I just went through with you in terms of target identification, grooming, and then actually inserting yourself in the critical moment to get your thing through. Okay. Other questions about business email compromise? I need to quickly adjust something here. So sometimes to take business email compromise to another level, you're not only going to hijack one account, you might hijack two accounts. And that's what the Iranian, like, nation states are like, oh, well, let's kick this up a notch. Because if we have a set of inauthentic identities that appear to be communicating legitimately, then the victim is much more likely to fall for that kind of lure. And this is what was uncovered last month. So an Iranian military team was basically using multiple personas at the same time to lure responses. And they were trying to hack into these policy institutes. So the government has these policy institutes to how are we going to respond to other nation states and what they're doing? What do we fear from them? How are we going to counteract what they do? And so nation states want to know what we think about them. That's like traditional espionage, right? And so two really important entities in this regard is the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Pew Research Center. And so what these folks did is they hijacked accounts on either side, and they started sending emails back and forth. Now, they're sending emails back and forth between these illegitimate accounts, but they're CCing a whole bunch of legitimate accounts. And then the idea is to try and get further access into these institutions. And so this is an example. This is the first spoofed message. Hey, we're interested in getting some information from you. So this is spoofed from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, trying to get information from someone in the Pew Research Center. And then the spoofed account in the Pew Research Center says, oh, looking forward to hearing from you. And then the response to that is, oh, here's my article I was working on. Can you just click on it and take a look at it? Here's the password, because it has to be encrypted. Otherwise, it'll be like defanged, and people figure out that it's actually malware being delivered. So it's encrypted. So I'm going to give you the password because it's supposed to be secret. It's a secret article, maybe. And then that's how, if there are a bunch of people CC'd on this, someone's going to fall for that and then click on that. And someone did. And then they figured out that, oh, this came from this email exchange, and it exposed the whole thing. Okay, so the idea is that when you spoof both two endpoints in that conversation, and you're really grooming, I mean, it more effectively grooms that conversation to make it more believable on the victim side. Okay, so how do we prevent this? Well, the first thing, you have a question. Yep. Yeah. So these are general techniques. So I'm putting this in the business email compromise. But yeah, this could be done in any number of ways to even do hacking individuals. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So user prevention. So you're the employee in the business. How do you play your part in preventing this? Well, the first thing is to be wary of urgent requests asking you to do something, but only to do something online. It's like, hey, I am in a meeting right now. Can you do this without calling me? Is one of the lures. It's like, hey, I need this done right now. I'm in a meeting, so I'm only available via electronic communication. And of course, that keeps you and the adversary connected without you trying to validate through a different channel that this request was legitimate. Another thing you might do, and this is if you have a lookalike account, is to beware of these external markings on your email that Google now has put on some of our communication, just to make sure you understand that if this identity is someone that you expect to come internally and is all of a sudden sending you things externally, then that needs to be labeled, because that's how lookalikes often are done. And I had a student come to my office yesterday with one where the Portland State professor was being impersonated from the exact same email name, but on Gmail. And so so fortunately, before taking my class, he figured out, oh, I should email the reply back to the pdx.edu account and not this Gmail account that has the guy's same name. So maybe that was his personal Gmail, but I'm going to send it directly back to the pdx.edu account. And then of course, that was an illegitimate Gmail account that was just taking the name of the professor sticking it in, creating a Gmail account for it, and then trying to lure personal information out of the student. Yeah.
Was that the email chain of somebody offering a job? Like a
Yeah. So that was a job offer, and then
I saw that bunch of those emails the last couple weeks. They're just like, we have this remote position for you, and I've selected you, and I'm the professor, and you just like reply if you're interested. And then
yep.
you reply.
And I do need your social security number because I'm going to pay you.
Yeah, if they reply, they're just like, congratulations, you got the job, and it's like, do I even interview or anything? Like,
Yeah, and then what they do want though is they do need a social security number, and we'll talk about monetizing that in a second.
yeah.
But yeah, that's what they're looking for.
But people are not falling for that, or at least some people are.
Well, yeah, so yeah, some people are. They wouldn't do it if people weren't falling for it. Is the unfortunate thing with that. Yep.
Actually, like for them to make fake interviews, like say like a video.
We're getting that too. Yeah, so it's better with multimedia to really convince you that, oh, this actually does look legitimate. Yeah, so deepfakes done targeting victims is unfortunately something that's going on, and I have an example of that later on as well. Another thing you can do is restrict the information that you share online that could be used by an adversary to impersonate you, or to be used by an adversary to claim your account, right? Because there's nothing stronger than claiming the account and having it come from my email address rather than having it just reusing my name. And so yeah, if you get an email from my Gmail account, like purported from my Gmail account, I never email students from my Gmail account. So yeah, don't believe it if it comes from a Gmail account. Only if it comes from pdx.edu, and hopefully I have two-factor on my email account. I have a YubiKey thing. So hopefully no one has hijacked that. But yeah, this is something where you do have to be a little bit wary of this. So all of these things that could be used to impersonate someone, you have to be cautious of. Okay, so don't use content and unsolicited messages directly. So again, if it comes from my Gmail account and I say, here's a link to the homework, don't click on it, right? Go to the homework site that you know, go to the code lab site, and then click on whatever lab I'm asking you to click on. But if I just send you a link from this Gmail and say, click on it, this is your homework, then you're in trouble because that link could go anywhere. Or if there's a phone number. So this is very common. And you saw this in the payment lures. It's like, I'm going to put a phone number in there for you to call, but then I own that phone number and I can manipulate you with that. So like if it comes from your bank, well, go to the bank website, type it in manually in your browser, find the contact for customer service or support, and then that's the phone number you would use. It's a little more trustworthy than getting it straight from the message. Here's an example. Is this legitimate or not? This is an email that I got in July. And you're like, huh, that kind of looks legitimate. So I have interacted with this company before. And I'm like, so this gave me pause. How many of you think this is legitimate? I didn't think this was legitimate, actually. I was like, no way, this can't be true. This can't be it. This can't be what, like they wouldn't just do this and like expect me to create this account. Turns out this was legitimate. But I had to call and I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah. I still didn't sign up for it, but like, I was like, is it? I had to know because I was so curious. I'm like, all right, well, I'm gonna stick this in my slides because it's really hard to tell, right? Like this is using some of those techniques to incentivize you to click, right? These are the same psychological techniques that adversaries are using, that this title company wants you to really use their service, right? This is good marketing, right? But it's the same kinds of things that, hey, big milestone unlocked, click here to register. And you're like, oh, wow, I want to see what my milestone is. Yeah, fear of missing out. Yeah, so that FOMO thing. So I was like, oh wait, this sounds awesome, and it still might be, but I don't know. So yeah, the CC. Well, this was the other thing. Yeah, it's like, why? Like this is, yeah. So you're like, And this is what I thought. I was like, this kind of looks fishy. But you see, the fact that this is ambiguous really means you can't trust your own judgment straight up on a message like this. So I've shown you a whole bunch of stuff that's definitely illegitimate, but this isn't. I don't want you to get to a point where you're cynical about everything, but there is a gray area here. And this is one of them. And this turned out to be legitimate, but because this is legitimate, this makes identifying the illegitimate much harder. It's much harder now.
After this class, I'm just gonna stop communicating with anyone.
I'm like, my mom is smart. She's like, I don't do the internet and I don't answer my phone unless it comes from one of us. And I'm like, yeah, that's why you still have all your money and your house and everything like that. And you're like, yeah, you're not really missing out. She doesn't miss out on all the stuff that's happening in social media and whatever. Like, yeah, she's fine. So
Too, like, it also gives you like an excuse for why you haven't gotten this email yet. It's like how it's cleared up, so that's why you're just getting this now. Like, yeah.
So I called them, and even when I called the real person I was dealing with over there, and even when she said, yeah, this is legitimate, I still didn't want to sign up for this thing just because I wasn't quite sure. And I was like, okay. So I actually, this particular company that you deal with, and I'll show you another message from them, does things right. And if you ever get to this point where you're either buying or selling property, hopefully you think about some of the things about when I present these next. Think about these things when you do so. Okay. The other way to prevent this stuff is as an organization to do some things. Like, what can I ask the city of Portland to do to prevent what happened over the summer from happening again? And so these are some of the things that like the FBI would recommend, or even any sort of information security professional would recommend. The first is monitoring user login locations for email, especially if they have hijacked your account. Now, obviously, there's nothing you can do if they're spoofing or they're doing a lookalike, but definitely for ones that are using the compromised account, you do have to monitor those login locations and do that user threat analytic thing that we talked about in the continuous authentication module, right? Like, you have to do authentication a little bit better than we've been doing in the past in order to identify this kind of behavior. The other thing, and this is something that adversaries will do when they've actually hijacked your email account, they don't want you to see every single message that comes into your inbox, right? Especially the ones that are responses to their spoofed message. Their malicious message going out. They don't want you to see the response, because then you're gonna like, what the heck is this coming back into my inbox? And so what they'll do is they'll install a filter, a mail filter in your inbox, so that specific messages will just go straight to that different folder and skip your inbox. And so organizations need to monitor any new filters that are installed in inboxes, because most people don't install filters in their inbox. Like, and when they do install filters, they install it like once in a blue moon. Like, I haven't touched my Gmail filters in like, I don't know, a year or two. This is not a frequent event, so that when it happens, you should scrutinize this as an organizational policy. The other thing is enforce multi-factor authentication and step up authentication for sensitive data access. We talked about at the very end of last class about a company that redacts all of the sensitive information out of email. And then when you actually want to get access to that thing, you have to do a step up, a multi-factor. And so when the adversary has compromised the email account and is trying to go through all the messages, all of the important stuff has been redacted, and to access that, they need that stronger second factor. So that's the idea of that. The next one is to double check for really important financial transactions. Make sure you double check that payment information using an out-of-band channel. So again, this is kind of like a multi-factor thing where, yeah, I can do it over email, but then the actual information exchange will happen in a different channel that's not email. And that forces the adversary to compromise multiple things, and hopefully a physical process right? Because like if it's just a phone call, well, then the hacker might try and spoof the phone call, which actually has happened. There has been a case where the adversary not only is hijacking the phone call to a bank, but also the online stuff. So if they can do that at the same time and that's your out of band, then they got you. And this is how they got one of these security professionals. And this particular person wrote about it because he was like, I thought I knew security. This is my job. And I still got $10,000 taken away from me because the adversary was hijacking both channels at the same time. So yeah, you would think about that. And then, yeah, so this is similar to the other one. Always verify these things either in person or a call to a known phone number ahead of time. Like, you know, this phone number ahead of time, and then you would call it if you need to, sort of send important information. So I mentioned that company that I was working with really does things correctly. And so this is the message, like if you want to do a transaction through this title company, this is what they send you up front. They first tell you that they're obsessed. And they're like, okay, well, prove it to me. Well, they're telling you exactly how fraudsters work. They're like, they're gonna try and intercept the wiring information for this financial transaction. And we're gonna let you know ahead of time that this is going to happen. So that's the first thing. They tell you about it. The second thing they do is they're like, you know, your banking information, that wiring information that's going to be so critical in this transaction, we want you to go to a notary who's going to check your physical ID and they're going to notarize a form where you have written out the payment information, and we're not going to allow that to change, right? So now that's your out of band. That the adversary is like, okay, can't hijack that. I'm going to go find a different title company to basically work on to get this thing to work. So that's the second one. And then this thing, they're telling you, don't trust your email, always verbally confirm things from this phone number that we're going to provide you at the outset. We're going to give you this phone number ahead of time. Before any transaction takes place, and it could be in person or the business card or whatever, whatever relationship you've established at the beginning, that's the phone number to call. Don't call anything else that you see in an email. So that was the next one. So yeah, so this is something to think about because these channels are being hijacked by adversaries. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about are synthetic identities and deepfakes, which someone had already mentioned earlier. So synthetic identities are a means to an end typically. The idea is to combine real and fabricated information to try and create profiles that can manipulate users. And so this is very prevalent on social media. And they're used for phishing or posting disinformation. We're going to talk about disinformation later on, but for the most part, we're going to talk about phishing right now. And this is basically what that Twitter deal, which is going to close this Friday, like tomorrow, apparently got held up with. It was the amount of synthetic identities on Twitter. So this is a big deal, and it's like 1 million fake accounts are created every day. So that's a lot, actually. That's a lot to delete, right? This is so if Twitter ever got rid of their fraud team, like the whole service would be useless because it'd be overrun. So this is prevalent in social media due to this trust factor. When we use social media, if someone can get in our network and then they start sending things in our network, they could be using all of the information from an actual friend we have in real life, but they could just be setting up an identical copy that looks like your friend. When they get into your social network and send you a lure, you are much more likely to actually fall for it. And that's the strategy. And so they can generate the fake profile, or they can duplicate a profile of a legitimate user, right? You have your social media profile, It's got pictures. It's got hopefully not your employment history and your school history, but all of that could be used to do an identical copy. And this has been going on. So this is an issue in at least my daughter's high school, like people creating duplicate profiles of students and then doing cyberbullying with that profile. So this is something that's easy to do because we publicly say, here's my profile. We're advertising ourselves. One of the most popular places to do this is in LinkedIn, right? Adversaries are trying to make money, and the people in LinkedIn typically have the money, right? Like this is a professional network. So you could fish Instagram, but like how much money do teenagers have versus, well, actually I have an Instagram account, but like most of the folks, that demographic is much younger. And so here's probably the best example of this is these fake CISO profiles, right? Like if you can fake being a chief information security officer and then get someone to fall for it, you are a position of authority, right? And you might be able to access other people in positions of authority. So this is big. This is like whaling in terms of your targeting. And so you can do this. This was done so well, and this is why I'm using this thing. So this was last month as well. Victor Sites. You're like, who is the chief information security officer at Chevron? And Google's like, oh, well, it's clearly Victor Sites. And then you go to Victor Sites' LinkedIn, you click on that thing, and you're like, oh, wow, the CISO since 2019, education, Texas A&M. Maybe I should add this person to my social network and become connected to someone really famous. So I'll send in an invite, and that's what they're doing. But then if you look, what's the second search result? That's the actual CISO of Chevron. And so they trick Google, right? And if you can trick Google, people are going to be like, oh yeah, that's legit because Google knows everything, right? So that was this one. And of course, if you're an adversary or you're a nation state, you're like, well, this is something we got to use. And that's what North Korea has been doing. And so they're basically copying and pasting people's LinkedIn profiles, and then they're trying to land jobs, right? Because if they can get a job, a remote job, so we were talking about this remote job stuff, they can get a remote job in one of these FANG companies, or like, oh, I can get on the inside and do all sorts of stealing. So that's the idea of this particular thing. So that's businesses, but like you also want to be able to make money in other ways. And so another thing that they'll do is to use these synthetic identities to basically steal money from credit card companies or from banking institutions. You could also use them to launder money, but for the most part, it's just to steal money. And so this is a number that should give you pause. $20 billion lost using synthetic identities for fraud. And so what's the workflow here? The first one is to obtain a social security number, perhaps of a child or from a student who needs work. That's why this is why that thing went around, because they're like, hey, there's a whole bunch of students in Portland State who need work. Here's a juicy remote job. Just send me your social security number so I can validate, I can do a background check, maybe that kind of thing. And then, okay, I'll offer you the job, and then you'll never hear back from that person. But if you've given up your social security number, you should probably lock your credit right now, because what they do with that social security number and your information is they start to apply for credit using your fraudulent information or your fraudulent address. And they'll get denied, but the denial event actually starts building your credit. So even if you don't have any credit established using that social security number, the fact that you did get denied actually establishes the beginning of your credit. And so like one of my colleagues showed me an Instagram post where they gave up the full name of a baby, their newborn, the date of birth, and then they posted that. Well, that is halfway into to applying for a social security number. And as soon as you apply for a social security number, you have that child's financial credit, like financial history at your disposal as an adversary. And then you can start applying for credit. It's like, yeah, a 2-week-old is applying for credit. Yeah, that's gonna eventually, I mean, it might get denied a couple of times, but that's when the credit is established on this particular thing. And then you just keep on applying until someone gives you credit, right? Somebody will, especially if it's a financial institution that is using legacy identity verification. So you'll slip through the cracks on some agency, and then you just build up your credit and then cash out. And that's how credit works. You just get good credit, get a whole bunch of money, and then stop paying, like disappear. And then the victim is left with a terrible credit rating that saddles them for the rest of their life. So this is reported 85 to 95% undetected. If you click on this link, oh shoot, that's not linkable. I have the reference for this if you're interested. Do you have a question? Yeah.
I know most school districts now, only because you used to ask for, it's voluntary to provide a student social security number, and parents could, but they don't even ask anymore because there's such a target for it.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, most K through 12, they don't do that. We used to do that. Like when I got here, your ID number was your social security number. And then I think it was like in the late, like 2008 or yeah, 2007 or 2008, they switched over. I was like, thank you. Okay, so another thing, and this is really hot over the last couple of years because we're giving away a lot of money. The US government is just giving it away. They're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna throw money at the population for this, that, and the other. Basically $20 billion in losses in 2021 due to fraudulent applications for government benefits. That's the estimate. And so this was an article where the PPP, this was the sort of the stopgap emergency measure to prevent COVID from completely wrecking the economy. And so as soon as this program was established, because it was established in a hurry, they weren't able to put the controls in place that they needed to prevent fraud. And this is just, I'm not judging, this is what happened. They had to get it out in a hurry. Of course, mistakes are going to be made. And then, 20 billion, if you're trying to save a however $1 trillion economy, maybe that's small potatoes to this government, to this country at least. And so the question is, hey, student loan forgiveness, how can I hijack that? And that's where working on the process for doing this is going to be very important. And hopefully we have a little bit more time to get this right so that maybe we're only going to lose 10 billion instead of 20. But this is the next thing that you might think about. And I think someone referenced this last class about the student loan forgiveness. Yeah, this is the next thing. Here's one from over the summer, fraudulent identities for cyber warfare to try and reveal locations of Russian soldiers. So these Ukrainian hacktivists. There's a collection of Ukrainian hacktivists that are basically targeting Russians. And this was where they were trying to lure soldiers into sending photos from the front line with the geographic coordinates in the photo itself. It's like, hey, I don't think you're in the front lines. Prove it to me. And I'm like, oh, I'll send you a photo with the GPS coordinates. And that's how they got the targeting information on these particular people. Okay, so what's really, well, actually, it was really sad is that this is being weaponized. So there are services to do this for you because you have to be able to do this at scale, right? There's a reason why 1 million fraudulent Twitter accounts are being created a day because they got good tools. They got good automation. This is a whole software ecosystem now. And so here's one site where you just like fake name generator, gives you a fake name, fake address, all of this stuff, the maiden name, even a social security number. So it looks authentic. And the person receiving this is like, I don't know if this is authentic or not. What am I going to do? Check every single one of these things or just allow this person to create the account? So that's the idea. Here's one. You can fake the fake face. Sorry, fake the face. So you can generate a profile, a user profile that's not an actual thing. And so this generative neural network stuff is really becoming popular. Like Meta has just done something where you can generate a video based on a description of what you want, and then it would generate that thing. Yep.
So John Hammond, who actually wrote one of the articles, I made a website. I forget what it was called, but it basically takes this person does not exist and an actual letter.
Oh yeah, I got that. In fact, that's this next one. So let's do this. Which face is real? So I'd like to say I'm better than 50-50, but yeah, let's just do this as a class because I actually think this is kind of instructive to actually see.
Pretty good score on this, but only because it's usually pretty easy to tell. Like,
Okay, I'm going to do this by vote in the class. How many of you think the left one is real? Okay, 1, 2. Oh, most of you. So I'm just going to click on the left one.
No.
Oh.
Look, okay, so look at the background. Look at the background.
Oh, the background. All right. Well, we'll just play. We'll just play again. All right. How many of you think the left one is real? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. How many of you think the right one is real? Okay. The right one is the one that wins. Oh, you're correct. Okay.
Oh no, look at it. There's a second person in there and their face is normal.
All right. We'll do a couple more of these. How many of you think the left one is real? We got 2. How many of you think the right one is? All right. Okay, so, but this is close, okay? You could admit that this is pretty close to being like undecidable. So that's what we're dealing with. So this is really leading us to something more nefarious, is deepfakes. So you actually can impersonate someone using imagery, fake imagery. And this happened over the summer as well. This happened 2 months ago. So this is from Binance. So Binance is this cryptocurrency exchange. And so the crypto exchange's CCO, Chief Crypto Officer, I guess is what the CCO is. Basically, his profile is public. He gives interviews. All of his information is out there as a public figure. He's in a position of power. So if you can somehow hijack his position of power using a deep fake, you have some leverage there. And so he was getting messages from multiple people thanking him for attending meetings that he never attended. And that should make you really nervous, right? Like if he did that to me, I'd be like, oh God, what did I do to make a student mad at me? Well, you know, I'm not really in a position of power though, so it would be kind of a waste of your time to go after me. But basically they used old interviews to generate a realistic image and sort of imagery out of it. And then they were trying to use that deepfake to defraud other crypto projects that were trying to work with Binance. And so he did a screenshot and was like, hey, this is the kind of message I was receiving. And then it was like, oh, somebody is impersonating your hologram or something like that. And then this is how it got exposed. And I think this article is linked in here. So if you're interested in that, it's there. Okay, so yeah.
There's actually software that can, in real time, if you're like on a Zoom call, put a deep fake over your face and it'll track it. And it'll do it in real time.
Yeah.
That's not a video that they made in processing.
Yeah. So basically overlaying imagery that makes you look like someone else. And then if you can do the voice at the same time, that's where the technology is going. It's not quite there yet in terms of being both real-time video and audio and having it be realistic, but it's
They did the face, but they could do the voice. And another video they did voice, and then they have that one where they married.
yeah. And so the voice is really pernicious, especially if we talked about phishing, voice phishing. Yeah, that's pernicious, because if they get that done correctly, then they can use that for spear phishing much more effectively. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is hacking society, and this is known as coordinated inauthentic behavior or disinformation. Kind of lump these two things together. And the idea is to shift a society's perception of things. Information warfare is another one of these things that you'll come across. The most, I guess, well-known example of this is the 2016 election, where in Russia, they had this internet research agency, and they were tasked with using and abusing Facebook to shift the opinion of the American electorate. And that's what they did. This is a summary article, but they weaponized social media for their own political aims. So there's that. They got so good at this, they basically have a botnet of compromised home routers that are not being patched. Like that could be one of ours, but basically it's like all of these home routers with default usernames and passwords. They collected them all up, and they built a tool that allowed these routers to post inauthentic messages. Now, the reason why they have to do that is because if all the inauthentic messages came from the Internet Research Agency's IP address range, it's like, oh, I can just filter all those. And so this is what they're doing. They need the infrastructure to pull this off. And that's what they're using with this Fronton tool. And they are using this botnet to do things like undermine support for the West, in the West, sorry, for Ukraine. So they're trying to undermine things by posting perhaps negative, fake stories about maybe the Ukrainian government or the military, or maybe war atrocities that the Ukrainians have quote unquote perpetrated in order to undermine the support. So that's something that's ongoing. And then there is a fascinating set of articles about the information warfare campaign between Ukraine and Russia, and who is winning it, and what are the unexpected consequences of losing that information warfare. And so that's basically, people are thinking, yeah, Russia pretty much lost the information warfare part of this conflict. I point this out. This is a rarity, but sometimes government agencies lose their way and they try and do the exact same thing back towards other nations. And so this was something that was exposed a couple months ago, and this is going to lead to Congress doing something about, because this is typically not what you want to have happen, where now you've muddied the water because we're doing the exact same thing back that people are doing to us. Like we're creating fake social media accounts to try and shift opinions of US policy in other countries. So we're basically doing with this particular one, and it was done so poorly that it was like the benefit of doing this poorly it doesn't outweigh it's more damage than help, is basically what this campaign is, where this was basically a contractor basically trying to do an information operation against other countries. All right, so some countermeasures to this: PolitiFact, Snopes ratings, factcheck.org ratings. A lot of this fact-checking stuff came out of in response to basically all the fake news and disinformation that came out of the campaign. So you'll see some of these icons, or maybe not. It depends on how much news you read, but you'll see some of these things in your feed. The other thing that's really helpful is bias ratings. So you're always having to think about what is the bias of any news article that I'm reading. And so this helps you at least, and it's both for the left and the right, just so that you're aware of how you're being manipulated with everything you read. And it really is everything you read. It's like almost everybody who's writing has an agenda. So you should just know what the agenda is before you read it, right? Like that's something that hopefully we're starting to learn as we go on, as opinions are being weaponized. And this is all sides view of this, right? Like this is not something that like even is an absolute thing in the end. The furthest left. So yeah, so this is not to say that this is everyone's view of this spectrum as well. So this is, again, might be a biased. All sides, I don't know what the leaning of all sides is, but they're trying to be independent, but no one is truly independent. This is why they give you implicit bias training, like especially for diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're like, everyone comes in with biases, like I do, like, and you have to know your biases, and you have to know that everyone else is bringing biases. And like, this is one of these things. It's like all sides might appear objective, but realize even they are biased, right? Like someone is doing this rating, and someone who does these ratings is also biased. So that's what I put this out there, because that's the only real way to think about disinformation, is to see, am I being played, or can I get a range? What I would do is get a range of opinions in order to really understand this. But most people are targeting one of these silos and then getting all their information from one of these things. Okay, yep.
Also, it says on the bottom that
Oh, okay, so they're up front. So actually, this makes me a little more comfortable, because they're actually saying, how was this done? And they're being transparent about this, not trying to claim objectivity. They're just presenting you the results of what they surveyed. But then you hopefully they would, like, if you wanted to dig deeply, how were those folks selected? This is a definite issue with machine learning. How was your data selected? Who did you get that from? What are the biases in the data? The sampling of the data. So my favorite countermeasure, though, is this one. I'm going to leave you this one, because I love memes. I love XKCD and I love memes. So this is the way they respond to disinformation by Russian state media. This is how Ukrainians responded, and this is not the Ukrainians. This is some folks in the West. They have this. So it's a spoof off of NATO, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, where they combat disinformation via this dog meme. And so anytime they see someone tweet something that's obviously propaganda, they just in the response, they post this dog meme. And then people laugh at the original tweet. And this actually, if you click on this, the folks posting the disinformation, well, it's just bias. They're all mad at this organization. It's not even an organization. This is just like an internet thing that people were like, yeah, let's just post the heck out of them. So the U.S. Cyber Brigade. Well, the Cyber Brigade isn't. They're just reporting on the fact that this meme is being used to identify. So this is way better than labeling the PolitiFact thing. It's like, yeah, let's just put this hilarious meme next to everything we don't think is serious, and then that basically that definitely has an impact on things. This is going to be a longer module, so I'm expecting a couple weeks here as we go up through the protocol stack. And very specifically, this is not a networking class. We are looking at security issues with some of the networking protocols up and down the stack. And this will give you a flavor for how that authentication stuff and the those protocols that we worked on, the cryptographic protocols that we worked on, it'll give you a flavor for why those things are important when you start to apply them to protect things like the network. This is going to be a short tour through the protocol stack, and then with a look at the flaws. So the first thing I need to talk about is the internet protocol stack. One of the things that is a design decision for the internet is to have a minimal protocol at the network layer. And that leads to this, what they call an hourglass design. And so the network protocol stack for the internet is structured in this hourglass that you see on the right, where you have a whole diversity of applications at the top, and then you have a smaller number of application protocols underneath, a smaller number of transport protocols, and then finally a single network layer protocol, IP, in the middle. And then this IP layer can operate over any number of data link layers underneath. So the RFC that defines the internet protocol is 791 and 1812. And it's an extremely simple implementation. So the way things work is that these protocols are layered right on top of each other, like you see in that hourglass. And it allows you to take a modular approach for designing communication. And it allows for interoperability. So I am going to briefly talk about layering in the internet protocols and how it's structured. And to do this, I typically use this Russian doll analogy for packets going over the internet. You start with application data. So maybe you're a web browser and you want to get a URL. And so you say, hey, get this URL. And then the server is going to respond with some application payload, like an HTML file. And this is what we call the application layer. And another term for this in the internet is layer 5. Layer 5 is typically identified as the application layer. This could be HTTP, it could be email, SMTP, it could be DNS, DNS query. Now, that is typically embedded in the next layer in the protocol stack in a transport layer header. So you're going to embed the application data inside the transport header, so TCP or UDP. And this is its payload. So in this case, if it's HTTP, this typically gets embedded in a TCP header. And then from there, so the transport layer header, so with the application, this is like endpoint to endpoint process communication, application to application communication. The transport layer is a layer that's responsible for process to process communication on that end host. This is typically wrapped in a network layer header. So this is the IP header that wraps all of that. And this is basically datagram delivery across the network. The next layer is the data link layer. So all of these IP packets are then wrapped in a data link layer frame. And then finally, this gets sent over the physical wire. So typically, this is numbered 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in terms of layer numbers. When you go and you look at a packet over the internet, you will see something that looks like this. You'll see in the payload, you'll see a URL. The transport layer header wraps that. And typically, it has a local port number that the source is using and a destination port number that the server is using. And for HTTP, the destination port that the server uses is port 80. And then this could be ephemeral, this source port. This is wrapped around IP address, both the source of the request and then the web server, the server's IP address as the destination. And then finally, you have this MAC header that wraps all of that. That's got hardware addresses that are only meaningful across that data link layer, that hardware layer. So this is a picture of what you would commonly see going across the network if you're listening to it. In terms of functionality, I like to use mapping to the US mail analogy, where this is basically the contents of a letter. Like if you have a letter that you're sending from one person to another across the country, say, your application data is the actual stuff that you've written on the letter that's in the payload. And that corresponds to a URL request over the internet. The transport information for US mail would be the actual recipient at that address. Maybe it's a dorm room number if you're in a dorm, or an apartment number if you're actually in like a condo or an apartment building. It could also be analogous to like the US Postal Service, Amazon, or any of these delivery services. That's the equivalent to the transport layer in the internet protocol, which is telling you the process address, maybe the sequence number, that kind of information. The network information is basically just your street address, city, state, and zip code. And this is equivalent to what you would get with the network source IP address and the destination IP address. And then finally, the data link layer information is basically the vehicle or person transporting that mail in the last hop. That's considered the last hop, like point-to-point communication. This is typically done with hardware addresses at the electrical layer, at the physical layer. Okay, so you're gonna get some experience with this by looking at things in Wireshark. So this is the de facto tool for people to monitor network activity over a network. And this is what adversaries might do. Like they get access to a machine, and then what they're gonna do is they're gonna monitor the network. In fact, they want to do this because if they start doing a lot of investigation and probing, what's gonna happen is that an alert is gonna get triggered. And so what they'll do is they'll like to passively monitor a whole bunch of stuff going by in your network in order to understand what are the critical pieces in the infrastructure I'm in. So that's why this is important. And this is why as a defender, you need to know what kind of information is going across your network, because it's what the adversary is going to be able to collect as well if they're running Wireshark in your organization. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly go through the UI for Wireshark. There are 3 windows in Wireshark. The top window is the packet history, the history of all the packets that have been sent on the network. The bottom one is the actual payload in bytes. And then the middle one is basically the structure of the Russian doll. It's like showing you the different headers that are representative of the packet that you selected. So this is what it looks like when you bring up Wireshark. You see a packet stream at the top that's in green. And you see there's some TCP packets that are unidentified, but then there are some that are HTTP clearly, and you can see a URL. If I click on this packet in gray, and this is what happens when you click on this, it turns gray. You can see in the middle, this is the Russian doll that I was just talking about. There is a data link layer frame on the outside, and if you expand this, you can get those hardware addresses. If you expand this, well, actually this one, if you expand this Ethernet one, you'll get its addresses. If you expand this one, you'll get the network layer header that has been used. So this is basically all the parts of that Russian doll are exposed when you click on this packet. And then when you click on any of these things individually, it will highlight the bytes in this raw packet data that correspond to the header that you have clicked. So when I click on this Ethernet 2 header, this is the Ethernet 2 payload. This is the framing bytes for the data link layer frame that goes on. If I click on the internet protocol header, then it'll highlight this IP header that follows, that is embedded inside of the data link layer frame. If I click on the TCP one, you'll see this is the TCP header of that packet. And then finally, if I click on the last protocol, you'll see the actual request. And this is the client request to the web server. Now, Wireshark knows all the protocols. It's continuously updating itself so that it can parse every protocol that you might see out there. And this is why it's used so prevalently in monitoring network traffic. Okay, so with that, I am now going to take a tour starting from the bottom of the protocol stack to the application layer, pointing out all these different protocols and the security issues they have. This is definitely focused. If you want a fuller treatment of the protocol stack, we do have a networking protocol class, but it's not necessarily focused on the security issues in the networking stack, like I am. Okay, so let's start with the lowest level, the data link layer. This is often referred to as layer 2. We're not going to talk about layer 1 that much. And the idea of data link layer protocols is to get a datagram from one node to an adjacent node that's physically connected to you, and physically by means of maybe wireless transmission from this laptop to that base station up there, or a wired connection from, if I had an Ethernet cable from this computer to a switch, maybe that Cat has provided. One of the pieces of terminology that is common is that when you think of a layer 2 packet, it's actually called a frame. And that's the naming of things at the data link layer. This is a picture of it. You have from point to point, like you have from your desktop to the local switch, you have a data link layer protocol that's only local to the operation between nodes that are directly connected to you. And then you see here on the right, this is your Russian doll. You have the application data, this is layer 5, layer 4, layer 3, and layer 2. the headers going back and forth. Okay, so when we talk about the framing protocol for layer 2, the big thing that I want you to know is that there are these hardware addresses that specify the source adapter and the destination adapter addresses. And these things are not IP addresses. These are manufacturer addresses that are assigned by the manufacturer of your network interface card, right? They'll give you a unique one. The other important thing with this framing protocol is that there's a field that specifies a protocol type, and this protocol type indicates what is the upper level protocol that I need to send this frame to. So we talked about IP, mostly everything being IP, the IP data, but you could have other protocols in the network layer, like ICMP, that requires you to use a different protocol sort of hierarchy, of different layer in the protocol stack other than IP. I just hid it from you in that hourglass because it's simpler, but there are other things that you could send frames to. So here's an example of what an Ethernet frame looks like. So when I highlighted the data link layer frame, there was a bunch of bytes. Well, this is the format of those bytes. This is what those bytes correspond to. It's a 6-byte destination address, a 6-byte source address, a type field saying, well, what is the network layer I need to send this to, this particular piece of data. And then this is whatever data is in that payload, and then a cyclical redundancy check. This is an error check, typically. And so this is why these are the main things that we're going to talk about in this layer, as well as media access. Okay, so I talked about addressing. The MAC address is a flat address, and it's kind of like your social security number. It goes with you, and it goes with this device, whichever network it wanders to. And so there's a unique identifier that's bound to my devices. And so if I take this device and I go somewhere else and someone records the MAC address, they'll know based on the MAC address that this is the same physical device, unless I reprogram it, which people do to do a different identity. This is different than the IP address. The IP address is hierarchically allocated so that if I take this laptop somewhere else, I'll get a new IP address that's similar to your postal address, right? Like as soon as you physically move, you get a new postal address. And this is meant to make routing scalable, right? This is a way of organizing the network addresses in a way to make routing efficient. So these are two different things, but they're both revealing your location in some sense, or your identity in some sense. Okay. One of the key things with data link layers is how to manage access to them. And most broadcast link layers, and the reason why I'm talking about broadcast link layers is because this is where most of the security issues are. So broadcast link layers have to do two things. They have to support confidentiality, well, three things. So the CIA principles: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So how do you get this is the worst case of trying to secure things, because if I have a wired network, it's much easier to protect against attacks on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, because the adversary has to sit here and actually be physically plugged in order for me to like hijack some of that stuff. A broadcast data link layer, though, is different because the adversary just has to be nearby and see your signal, and you have to protect against all those different kinds of attacks. And so one of the things that broadcast link layers, so I'm going to talk about how a broadcast link layer mediates access first. And so this is going to target the availability part of this. How do we make sure that this network remains usable for everybody? And the way this happens is, so you have a wireless network here, and you have A, B, C, and D. And with broadcast data link layers, if you have data to send, you just try and send it, right? And a media access control layer is trying to figure out how to get everybody to send packets without causing a whole bunch of corruption, data corruption. Because if you have two people talking at the same time, you can't understand anything. And that's the issue that the broadcast layer is trying to solve. How do you coordinate transmissions so that we're not colliding with each other? And so here is the issue. So I have A, B, and C. Say A and C want to send packets simultaneously. They both have a frame to send, but when they send it, they don't know that the other terminal is trying to do the same thing. Now, eventually, as they send their packet, they'll start to get interfered with the other transmission. And so this is where, if you don't have any coordination, the entire this entire transmission time, it renders the frequency useless, right? Because this is happening. So you need some way to coordinate this. So the way this is coordinated in most 802.11 Macs, which is what we have here, is with this cooperative carrier sense multiple access scheme. So this should send alarm bells, right? It's cooperative, right? This means I trust the endpoints to be good citizens, to make sure I get what I need to. And it's basically this carrier sense multiple access says, while someone is transmitting, I am also going to have this person listen. And as soon as this person, any endpoint hears interference, it's going to stop transmission. So that's the cooperative part of this thing. So this is what it looks like. CSMA with collision detection is what this acronym stands for. You use carrier sensing to detect if someone else is transmitting data. And as soon as you figure out that someone else is interfering with you, you abort. And then what you'll do is you'll randomize your backoff time so that this doesn't happen in lockstep, right? So what A and C will do is say, hey, I got this collision. I am going to randomize my backoff to like maybe 10 milliseconds, give or take, and then try it again. And so as long as this thing is clear, I'm going to try and send, but to prevent these collisions, I'm going to have this random backoff. Now, this does allow collisions, and so that's not really something that you want. And so this was augmented later on with this thing called collision avoidance. So CSMA collision avoidance, and I should have probably spelled out the acronyms. I will actually when I go back and edit this slide. The idea of this is to try and do a reservation protocol on top of this, rather than to just allow people to send. Just like, you know what, I'm going to allow people to send a reservation whenever they need it, but I'm not going to let them just to send data immediately. And so that's basically what this is. And so anybody can, after a certain pause, do a request to send. And then the destination, after another pause, can say clear to send and identify which source is clear to send data. And it's only then that the data is sent. And by doing this kind of negotiation, you can make sure that the data won't collide. Now, the request to send and might collide, like two people doing a request to send might collide with low probability, but the idea is to make sure that the data frames don't collide. Okay, so that's the idea. And then they have these interframe spacing times in order to prevent, in order to reduce the number of collisions on the request and the clear to sends. Okay, so that's just functionally what's going on. When some other node in the network sees that this is going on, they will just defer their access for a fixed period of time. Okay, now this is all done with good intent, like everybody following good intentions, right? But like not everybody follows good intentions, and we'll see what can be done to abuse this kind of thing. Okay, so that's the availability piece, and that's what CSMA tries to do to make the thing available and give it high throughput. The other part of it is the confidentiality and the integrity part of this. And so confidentiality in broadcast networks, well, there is none because it's broadcast, right? So the problem here is that if you have, and this is the state of Wi-Fi circa 2000s, as everything was unencrypted. The issue is if you go and you hit an open access point, which people do, you could be on the left, your PC number 1, and you have this IP address and this MAC address, and you're like, hey, I want to communicate over the internet. And this is going over an open access point with 3 other machines on it, including an adversary over here on the right. If I send that Russian doll, which is the frame, the IP header, the TCP header, and then some application payload, say it's a form submission, that's got my username and password. If I know this is going to the internet, so this is the destination that's somewhere over here, what I'll do is I will create this data link layer frame that says, you know what, I don't want this adversary to see this frame. So I am going to direct this frame to ABCDEF 12345 and that's the MAC address of the router, the default router, because I'm trying to send this payload into the internet to log in. But if this is done in an open wireless network, then what I'll do is I'll send this out onto this the broadcast network. If you are typically, if you're on this network and you see this frame and you see that the destination MAC address is not for you, typically what you would do is discard it, right at the network layer or right at the network interface card. So the Ethernet card or the 802.11 card on either of these machines will just immediately drop this and the machine won't see it. The router sees that the destination MAC address, it matches its MAC address. And for that, it will actually take in this packet and do a routing operation on it to send it to its final destination. Now, the adversary sees this frame, but what the adversary does is it says, you know what? I want to monitor every single packet that goes over my network interface in what they call promiscuous mode. And promiscuous mode on a network interface card says disregard the check for this destination MAC address, just take it in regardless of who it's for, and then send it up the protocol stack so that I can see the data that's there. And so in this case, it's like, is it for me? No, but I'm gonna still look at it anyway and then pull this person's password out. So that's how it's gonna work in the data link layer. Okay, so obviously you don't want this to happen. So in our broadcast link layer, we require confidentiality and integrity to be bolted on. And we're gonna do this using the exact same cryptographic protocols that we talked about earlier in the class. And we talked about that in context of TLS. I had to give you an example protocol for where the key exchange was being done. The exact same style of key exchange is going to be done between a client machine and the access point. But it's going to be done in a point-to-point manner so that on the other side, it gets decrypted and sent in the clear. Now, this prevents a person on the wireless network from modifying the messages and overhearing the contents. But on the other side of the access point, it's decrypted. So I'll just say that. So with 802.11, we have had multiple failed protocol attempts. And I'm going to talk about the last iteration of this, WPA2, which most of us do, and talk about why we now need WPA3, which is something that is in most of the newer access points that are out there. These initial ones ended up doing a four-way handshake that was similar to establish that symmetric key. They did this handshake that's very similar to TLS 1.2. Now, do you remember why TLS 1.2 is no longer something that we recommend? That, what was the reason we went from TLS 1.2 to TLS 1.3? Anybody remember that from the cryptographic protocols? Not specifically, it'll come up again. Because I'm going to talk about WPA. So WPA is typically how we protect Wi-Fi access. And I'm going to talk about how most people use this at home. Like, how many of you are, like, if you've ever configured your home router, how many of you set WPA to PSK? This is how my network is set up. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how that works because it's how most home routers work, and for good reason. It's for this particular use in a home router, it's probably fine. This stands for a pre-shared key, where the passphrase for your wireless network that you set up front is going to be used to generate keying information. And so that's what this picture is. The passphrase derives a pre-shared key, and that key is shared between the client and the access point by knowledge of the passphrase that you use. From that pre-shared key, a pairwise master key is generated, which is this password hash of the PSK and the SSID with 4,000 iterations. And the reason why they do this is because they don't want people to just brute force the passphrase and see like a dictionary attack the passphrase and then see if it worked. And so by protecting the master key with that password hash, it makes a dictionary attack on the passphrase harder for someone to pull off. And so that should make sense based on the password security stuff that we covered earlier. Okay, one of the things about this is that anybody who knows the passphrase or who's trying to connect with this passphrase generates the exact same pairwise master key. Okay, this will become important because from this pairwise master key, all of the other keys that you are using to encrypt communication back and forth are bootstrapped off of this PMK. And so the way we do this is we basically have a nonce exchange to generate random numbers that can then be used to generate these encryption keys back and forth. So the issue here is that anyone who knows the passphrase can calculate each other's PTKs, which are these pairwise transient keys that are generated from the master key, and then decrypt all your messages. Okay, now this is fine in your home network. You give anybody your passphrase, you're saying, oh yeah, go ahead, use my network. Well, you are also giving them the ability to monitor all the traffic of all the devices going back and forth in your network. So realize that is happening. So this is good for home networks, right? Where you trust, hopefully you trust all of the devices and all the people that you give the passphrase to. But this is not good in a cafe. And this is definitely not good at Portland State, right? Like for you to know that the PSU, well, PSU Secure does something different, but if we all connected up to a shared network, like a cafe that offers up the password to their WPA, like that means that the implications of that is that all of your communications can be decrypted by the person next to you in that cafe is the issue. So that's WPA2 PSK. In Wireshark, you can auto decrypt wireless networks if you know that WPA password as a result of this, right? Because you can regenerate all those keys and then decrypt any of those frames going across a wireless network. So I wanted you to be aware of that. We have to do something differently here at Portland State or in any enterprise network. You don't want somebody who just knows the passphrase to be able to decrypt everyone else's messages. So we do something different. We do this thing called WPA2 Enterprise, which is what PSU Secure runs. And we replace passphrase-based authentication with actual user authentication. We force you to log in with your single sign-on Odin credentials. And the way this works is via this radius standard for enterprise account authentication. So there is a radius server. And when we connect up to this access point, that access point is going to force you to authenticate through a radius server before establishing your secret keys to communicate over the network. And so the key thing here is that this PSK is generated so in the pre-shared secret. So the PSK was the pre-shared secret in the previous mode. We're going to generate this per user, right? In order for you to prevent being able to decrypt each other's traffic. And so this prevents authenticated users on the same network from being able to decrypt each other's payload. This is what it looks like. And this is being done for both wireless and wired clients. So if an adversary goes and installs a secret router inside of your office to hijack all the traffic, this allows encryption over through the wired client as well. So it's a simple mechanism that can be used both for wireless and wired clients. And so the idea is that through the wireless access point or a switch, you would talk to this radius server, and then this would do the authentication. So when you connect up to PSU Secure, if you have done this before, you send your username and password. it uses this radius server to authenticate your backend. And so the identity provider here, which we have talked about, is the same identity provider that you do for single sign-on for your Gmail, for your Portland State Gmail. And then through this, the response gets passed back to this radius server, which will then bootstrap the encryption keys to connect through you. And this is basically this EAP standard that goes back and forth. Okay. This is the protocol. I'm not going to go through this protocol, but it's basically a protocol that my laptop talks to that thing up there. And then as part of this thing, it will forward my credentials to the authentication server. So the radius server, the identity provider, and this is done through SSL. And so the certificate, in order to prevent someone from spoofing the base station, there is a certificate that goes back and forth. So it's protected with TLS using a certificate signing thing that's different than the internet certificate. It's its own Portland State thing. And then this actually bootstraps the keying. So after all of this stuff is done, then you bootstrap the keying protocol here that's unique to the supplicant. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about for wireless networks. Now I'm going to talk about attacks on this thing because this is a network security class. The first attack, and this is an attack on the availability of 802.11. It's deauthentication and disassociation. And so authentication and association are two things that have to happen in a wireless network for you to be able to use it. And so the idea of this is for an adversary to deny you usage of this wireless network by spoofing deauthentication and disassociation messages so that the access point boots you out like deterministically. And it's cheap enough. If you really are, you have it in for someone, it's cheap enough to do this programmatically, unfortunately. So this is a deauthentication attack. The client does the authentication to get onto this AP, and then the association to associate itself. And then the attacker is listening to this. And as soon as the response happens, I'm going to say deauthenticate this client. And this is just using the 802.11 protocol and spoofing the wireless messages going back, because there's no there is no integrity checks going back and forth between the client and the AP, and this allows this thing to happen. Similarly, the disassociation happens the same way, and because there's no integrity check, there's no integrity check, even though they might share a key. There's no integrity check. Well, now there is, but no, there wasn't before. And this was happening. You can also attack availability by attacking these delays that are built into the collision avoidance mechanism that we talked about earlier. You realize that this cooperative nav vector, where people are like, oh, they're negotiating the transmission of data, so I'm going to back off. I'm going to be like, oh, this person got requested to send, got cleared to send, and is about to send like a certain amount of data. Everyone else on the network is like, okay, I'm going to go to sleep, right? And then, so that's how it works. The protocol works. And so there is this, there are two things you can do to jam this network. You could actually jam, you could do this physical attack on the frequency to jam the channel at the end of these intervals, knowing that if you jam the channel, all the clients are going to back off. And you only have to do it when it's timed very specifically at when these folks are going to try and come back and listen again on this network. So that's one of this thing. There's another one that's a virtual one. It's the same idea. It's just to wake up at the right time and to only jam it when you need it, and then cause everyone to back off. Another attack is the rogue access point attack. And this is the evil twin attack that I mentioned earlier that I gave my graduate student, who is now really wary about connecting up to PSU Secure because I told her I lied. That's bad. I'm gonna pay for that eventually, karmically. So you set up a fake access point and then you launch the person in the middle attack. And so this is the idea here is you can either hijack a vulnerable access point and actually become that access point, or you can just spoof the SSID of that access point and then perform the authentication. And so this is something that you can do in public areas. And this is why you have to be cautious when you're connecting up to these things, because someone could set up a honeypot, or what's also been done before is that their mobile phone hotspot, you can rename it to be whatever it is that you're expecting on that in that location, to basically become an access point where you're expected to be an access point. So here's a meme that I like, where it's like, oh, free Wi-Fi. This used to be the case before we had like unlimited data on these cell phone things. I'd be like, oh, free Wi-Fi. I'm totally going to save data. I'm going to connect to that thing. But the problem is that this can happen, and it's much easier for this to happen now that people can tether and take their wire. They become an access point themselves very easily. Yeah.
I believe this is something that there's like a DEFCON channel for, and I think it was titled something along the lines of like how I accidentally set down the network copies up. He did this exact thing, and because his card wasn't strong enough to deal with all of the traffic that would go through that entire thing, and it shut the network down. But I think it's like this very specific methodology.
Yeah, and it's easy if you go into a cafe, and even if it's protected by like a password, you're like, you have that password, right? You can set up your access point to have that password as well. And then at a cafe, you're like, well, yeah, it's got the same name as the legitimate one. It uses the same password. I will connect up through there. But then on the other side of that, it can be decrypted. And so we'll talk about how security is an end-to-end thing, an end-to-end property. You've got to be making sure you do the encryption and the CIA stuff at the higher level, at the application level as well, to prevent this kind of stuff. Okay, so this leads us to WPA3. This addresses all of these attacks and adds, so this was the thing I was fishing for earlier, it adds that perfect forward secrecy. So this is where the next iteration, and this is kind of bleeding edge. WPA3 is pretty new. Same with TLS3. It's within the last 2 or 3 years. So that's what has gone into the design of these things. So in particular, WPA3, so I'm not going to cover how it does PFS because it's basically similar to the way the TLS 1.3 did. So just can imagine that being done, but rather than on an end-to-end basis, is just on your local hop-to-hop basis. You're establishing those keys. The first one is this evil twin attack. And so this is the setup for what they're trying to prevent. They're trying to prevent an attacker from bringing up an access point that looks exactly the same as the victim, and then forwarding the victim's traffic through itself, through the attacker to the victim, and then have this thing redirect to an attacker server. And so again, we have an integrity problem, a source integrity problem. And so the way we solve source integrity problems is with integrity checks, right? And so that's what these message integrity check codes are. And so like things like disassociation and de-authentication, we can make sure we can establish a key, a shared key between these two things, and then we can use that to send integrity checks from point to point to keep someone from interceding in between these two things. And when you remember a wireless network, you can do this using, you can use this mechanism to make sure that it'll tell you that there's a brand new access point, and do you expect it here? And then you should say, maybe I'll trust you. Because that was the thing I was, like my student had do you expect to see PSU secure here? And I'm like, what do you think that answer should be? I was like, yeah, but does that prevent me from putting up PSU secure as well? And then that's what should give you pause, because even with that message, you should be thinking about what an adversary might do. And so this is one of the things you can use these integrity checks to make sure you can detect when this person in the middle attack happens. And this is done the exact same way as we talked about in the cryptographic protocols thing. So I'm not going to cover this. I'm just going to give you a picture of it and say, hey, look, they use message integrity check codes. That's what these MICs are, going back and forth to solve this problem. And that's what this OCV thing is doing. And then the same thing with beacon frame spoofing, because there's an information frame that gets sent back from the access point to the client. And if you can spoof that, the client can but like say, oh, the access point told me to back off, when in fact it was someone spoofing the beacon or the access point instead. And so they do the exact same thing. They have a beacon integrity key. And so you're checking this integrity check. So you're basically exchanging this beacon integrity key, and then you're attaching integrity checks from the genuine access point to the client. And so if an attacker is attempting to spoof the beacon frame, they can't generate this appropriately, this integrity check, because of this key. Well, with the way this integrity check is being written.